The road to Imphal did not begin with the sound of gunfire or the sight of Japanese columns moving through the jungle. It began with a grand, desperate strategic dream born inside the war rooms of the Japanese High Command, a dream that, if successful, would have changed the fate of Asia forever. By late 1943, Japan's empire, once expanding like wildfire across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, was under immense pressure. American forces were advancing through the Solomons, U.S. submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines, and the Allies were preparing for major counteroffensives in Burma. Yet the Japanese army, still confident in its ability to win battles on land, saw one final opportunity to alter the entire trajectory of the war: invade India, strike at the heart of British colonial power, and ignite a nationalist uprising that would expel the British once and for all. This bold plan became Operation Yugo, a sweeping offensive conceived by General Renya Mutaguchi, part dreamer, part fanatic, a commander so intoxicated by visions of glory that he ignored every logistical and tactical warning given to him by his subordinates. Mutaguchi believed the Japanese army was unstoppable, that his men were superior in willpower and spirit, and that the British Indian forces in Burma would collapse under pressure, just as they had in 1942 during Japan's lightning advance through Southeast Asia. But the situation had changed drastically by 1944. The British Indian Army was no longer the disorganized and demoralized force it had been 2 years earlier. Under the leadership of General William Slim, the 14th Army had been transformed into one of the most effective fighting forces in Asia. Slim had rebuilt morale, restructured supply networks, improved jungle training, and instilled a new sense of confidence into troops from across the British Empire. British regulars, Indian divisions, Gurkhas from Nepal, African units, and local Burmese levies. The Allies now had air superiority, improved intelligence, and a stable defensive position in eastern India. Yet Mutaguchi dismissed all of this. He believed that spirit alone, what the Japanese called seishin, would carry his army through. His target, the twin mountain towns of Imphal and Kohima, gateways to India, connected by winding ridges, dense jungles, and narrow mountain passes. The geography itself was unforgiving. The Indo-Burma frontier was not a simple line on a map, it was an enormous wall of mountains in deep jungle valleys, drenched in monsoon rains and choked with vines, leeches, malaria, and terrain so steep it broke animals' legs and shredded men's boots. The Japanese 15th Army would have to cross hundreds of miles of this terrain without mechanized transport, hauling artillery by hand, marching through rivers, climbing cliffs, and dragging supply animals behind them along paths barely wider than a man's shoulders. To Mutaguchi, this was not a challenge but an opportunity. He believed the British could not possibly defend such terrain, and that the Japanese army, steeped in Bushido and hardened by years of jungle warfare, would move through it like wind slipping through trees. He was catastrophically wrong. But in the early months of 1944, as preparations for Operation Yugo began, the Japanese army appeared confident. 3 divisions were assigned to the offensive: the 15th, 31st, and 33rd Divisions, veteran units that had spearheaded Japan's past victories across Burma and Malaya. Mutaguchi's strategy was deceptively simple. The 31st Division would advance north to seize Kohima, cutting the critical supply road between Imphal and the Indian city of Dimapur. With the road cut, Imphal would be isolated. Meanwhile, the 15th and 33rd Divisions would surround Imphal from the south and east, trapping the British Indian forces in a massive encirclement. Mutaguchi believed that once surrounded, the British-led forces would either surrender or die of starvation and disease. He expected to repeat the triumphs of the early war, a great encirclement leading to the capture or destruction of an entire Allied army. General Slim, however, had anticipated a Japanese attack. Through intercepted communications and reconnaissance, he sensed the Japanese were preparing a major offensive, but he too misunderstood the scope of the plan. Slim expected a limited Japanese thrust into Burma, not a major invasion of India. The idea that Japan would attempt to cross the mountains in force seemed absurd. Logistics alone made such an operation suicidal. The Japanese army had almost no trucks, no armored support, and no mechanized transport. Their supply system relied primarily on mules and porters, and even these were limited. Worse, Japanese supply depots were hundreds of miles behind the front. Yet Mutaguchi rejected all these concerns. He forced his staff officers to approve optimistic estimates, threatened to remove dissenters, and push the invasion forward. By early March 1944, the Japanese columns began to move. Thousands of soldiers slipped into the jungle, marching silently along narrow trails under thick canopies of bamboo. They carried only minimal rations. Mutaguchi believed they could capture British supplies once in India. They brought heavy artillery pieces that had to be disassembled and dragged by hand. They wore down their bodies long before reaching the battlefield, but still they marched, driven by the belief that the offensive would change the course of the war. For the British and Indian soldiers stationed at Imphal in Kohima, the Japanese attack came with shocking speed. Patrols reported enemy movement in the jungle, strange activity along the mountain passes, and increased ambushes along supply roads. Radio intercepts revealed fragments of the Japanese plan, but the full scope of the assault remained unclear until it was already unfolding. Then, in late March 1944, the 33rd Division struck toward Imphal from the east, while the 15th Division advanced from the south, driving through mountain passes and wiping out isolated British units. Simultaneously, the 33rd Division swept toward Kohima. The trap was closing. Imphal itself was a vital logistical hub for the British Army in Burma. It was home to supply depots, airstrips, and hospitals, and it sat at the end of a single road leading through the hills to Kohima and onward to Dimapur. The British Indian Corps stationed there consisted of several divisions, including the famed 5th Indian Division and the 17th Indian Division, battle-hardened but exhausted after months of fighting. Slim understood immediately the danger. If Imphal fell, the entire Allied position in northeast India would collapse. If the road to Dimapur was severed at Kohima, the divisions at Imphal would be trapped. So, Slim made one of the most brilliant decisions of the campaign. Instead of ordering his forces to hold forward positions in Burma, he pulled them back to Imphal with speed and precision, slipping out of Japanese encirclement before it could solidify. It was a logistical miracle. Armored units, artillery batteries, columns of infantry, and thousands of vehicles streamed back through narrow mountain roads under constant threat of Japanese ambushes. Trucks crashed off cliffs, vehicles got stuck in mud, but Slim's forces made it to Imphal just before the Japanese trap snapped shut. Within days, Imphal was surrounded. Roads were cut, Japanese artillery opened fire from the hills, snipers targeted anyone who moved in daylight. Japanese infantry overran small outposts, trying to tighten the encirclement. The British Indian forces inside prepared for a long siege, but unlike the Japanese, they had an ace the enemy lacked: air supply. The Allies had developed a sophisticated airlift system using Dakotas in transport planes to deliver food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. It was the first time in history an entire army would be sustained solely by air supply. The Japanese, by contrast, had no such capability. Their supply lines stretched back through impossible terrain, relying on exhausted porters who were already starving. Mutaguchi's fanatical belief that his army could live off the land proved to be detached from reality. There was no food to forage in the mountains. Japanese soldiers began to starve immediately. While Imphal came under siege, Kohima, far smaller, far more isolated, faced an even worse fate. The garrison at Kohima was tiny, consisting mostly of lightly armed troops, administrative units, cooks, clerks, and a few rifle companies. They were supposed to guard the road, not fight a major battle. But now they found themselves directly in the path of the Japanese 31st Division, which surged toward them with thousands of battle-hardened infantry, determined to capture the town, cut the road, and isolate Imphal completely. By early April, the Japanese were outside Kohima. The siege was about to begin. The British Indian defenders dug in among the hills, trenches, gardens, and bungalows of the little mountain town. They fortified a makeshift perimeter around the deputy commissioner's residence, its tennis courts soon to become the most famous battleground in the entire Burma campaign.
They were heavily outnumbered, short of supplies, and exhausted from constant marching. Japanese troops surrounded them from all sides, cutting every route of escape. The defenders quickly realized the truth. They were fighting for survival. The storm that would engulf Kohima and Imphal was unlike anything the Allies had seen in Asia. It would become known as the Stalingrad of the East, a brutal, grinding battle of encirclement, starvation, monsoon rains, disease, close-quarter combat, and relentless assault. It was a battle fought not just across hills and ridges, but across tennis courts, gardens, and mud-soaked trenches. A battle where soldiers fought hand-to-hand for yards of ground. A battle where an entire Japanese army would be destroyed in the jungle. And the nightmare was just beginning.
When the Japanese 31st Division reached Kohima in early April 1944, the defenders of the tiny mountain town realized instantly that they had become the focal point of one of the most critical battles of the entire war. Kohima was not a city, it was not even a large town, it was a hilltop administrative station, a cluster of bungalows, supply huts, tea gardens, ridges, and a few narrow roads winding up through thick jungle. Yet its importance could not be overstated. Kohima sat astride the only road linking Imphal to Dimapur, the massive supply base in India. If Kohima fell, Imphal, already surrounded, would be strangled to death. No food, no ammunition, no reinforcements, no escape. And with Imphal gone, the Japanese would have a direct road into India's heartland. The British Empire would be shaken to its core. The defenders of Kohima were not elite frontline soldiers. They were clerks, cooks, signalers, transport drivers, and a handful of infantry companies from the 4th Battalion, Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, along with elements of the Assam Regiment and miscellaneous units pulled from administrative and logistics staffs. In total, barely 2,500 men were present, many of whom had never expected to fight a pitched battle. They had almost no heavy weapons, no tanks, little artillery supports, and limited supplies, but they held the high ground, and they knew they had to hold it until relief forces could fight their way up from Dimapur. The Japanese were the opposite. The 31st Division, more than 12,000 strong, commanded by Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, advanced toward Kohima with confidence. They had been ordered to seize the ridge quickly, cut the road, and then march south toward Imphal. Sato's men were veterans, hardened by years of jungle warfare. They believed in Japan's destiny to liberate Asia from Western rule. They also believed, incorrectly, that Kohima was defended by a weak, demoralized rear echelon garrison that would collapse in days. Instead, they found a garrison ready to die in place. When the Japanese encirclement closed on April 5, 1944, Kohima immediately transformed from a quiet administrative outpost into a hellish pressure cooker of artillery fire, sniper duels, knife fights, and desperate minute-by-minute survival. The defenders hastily dug trenches and foxholes around whatever cover they could find. The deputy commissioner's bungalow, the tennis court, the jail garrison, the treasury, and the surrounding ridges of Garrison Hill, Jail Hill, and Kuki Picket. There was no prepared defensive line, only dirt, sandbags, loose rocks, and the sheer determination of the men trapped inside. The Japanese arrived with overwhelming force, pouring down from the surrounding hills, firing rifles and machine guns, launching mortars, and attempting to storm positions from multiple directions simultaneously. The battle quickly devolved into a maze of broken terrain, overturned furniture, shattered walls, uprooted trees, and earth torn apart by explosions. The Japanese dug in on opposite slopes, establishing snipers and machine gun nests that dominated every exposed path. They fired on anything that moved. Water parties trying to reach nearby streams were killed. Runners carrying messages were shot mid-stride. Even medical orderlies dragging wounded men back to aid stations found themselves under constant fire. Then came the attack on the deputy commissioner's bungalow, which overlooked the town and the vital road. Beneath it lay a modest tennis court, flat, rectangular, and now one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire Burma campaign. The Japanese understood its significance, so did the defenders, and soon the fight for this tennis court would become one of the closest, most savage small-area battles of the entire Second World War.
The Japanese assault began with a ferocious artillery and mortar barrage that pulverized the defensive positions. Trees shattered into splinters, the bungalow collapsed into rubble, the tennis court fence blew apart. Dust and smoke created a suffocating haze. As soon as the barrage lifted, Japanese infantry charged through the debris, bayonets fixed, grenades in hand, screaming as they closed the distance. The defenders, mostly men from the Royal West Kent Regiment, held their ground, firing rifles, Bren guns, and throwing their own grenades across the tennis court. But soon, the Japanese closed to within a few yards. The fighting became hand-to-hand. Across the narrow width of the tennis court, soldiers fought in trenches separated by no more than 20 yards. They could hear each other breathing. They could hear shouted commands, whispered prayers, and the desperate scrabble of boots against loose earth as attackers climbed their trench edges. Nights were the worst. Under the dim light of the moon, Japanese troops would crawl silently across the court, dropping into British trenches, slashing with bayonets, stabbing men in the dark. Grenades were tossed back and forth like deadly balls in a grotesque game. Machine gun bursts tore through the night. Flashlights were never used. To flick one on was suicide. The British and Indian defenders clung to their positions with bleeding hands. Men fought until bayonets broke, until barrels overheated, until trenches filled with bodies. They reinforced weak points by dragging furniture, sandbags, and corpses to create makeshift barriers. They had no room to retreat. Every inch lost brought the Japanese closer to the heart of the defensive perimeter. The siege wore on. Days blurred together in a haze of gunfire, exhaustion, pain, and hunger. Water ran critically low. Resupply was nearly impossible. Japanese snipers covered every exposed inch of ground. Food dwindled, and many soldiers survived on a few biscuits or handfuls of rice per day. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations inside basements and shelters, listening to explosions overhead and wondering if they would be buried alive.
Despite overwhelming numbers, the Japanese failed to break the defensive line quickly. Kohima was proving far more resilient than Sato had anticipated. He committed more battalions to the assault, tightening the noose, applying steady pressure along Garrison Hill and the surrounding ridges. Each attack pushed the defenders closer to collapse. But the British Indian forces were not alone. Reinforcements were fighting their way toward Kohima from Dimapur. The 2nd British Division in the 161st Indian Brigade, struggling through Japanese roadblocks, ambushes, and snipers along the twisting Imphal-Dimapur road. Every mile had to be earned. Every bend in the road brought fresh danger. But slowly, relentlessly, they pushed forward. Inside Kohima, the defenders held on with diminishing strength. The tennis court became a symbol of their determination. Bodies littered the ground. Trenches overflowed with water and blood. The Japanese launched repeated night attacks, sometimes breaching the British lines, only to be driven back by counterattacks using bayonets, grenades, and even fists when ammunition ran out. A section of the line changed hands 6 times in one night. The earth turned into mud churned with bone fragments, shell casings, and blood. Still, the defenders refused to break. By mid-April, after nearly 2 weeks of continuous fighting, the defenders were at their breaking point. Ammunition was nearly gone. Water was dangerously low. Many soldiers could barely stand from exhaustion. The wounded lay in trenches too weak to move. Commanders feared the next Japanese assault would finally overwhelm them. Then, on April 18th, the sound of distant gunfire shifted. The relief column had reached the outskirts of Kohima. The advance units of the relieving forces, depleted themselves from constant fighting along the road, pushed into the shattered defenses of Kohima. Japanese snipers and machine gunners fired from hidden positions, forcing the relief units to fight through the ruins yard by yard, just as the defenders had done. But slowly, the noose around Kohima began to loosen. Japanese units pulled back to ridges west of the town, preparing for a prolonged battle along the hills. The siege of Kohima had lasted 2 grueling weeks, but it was far from over. Now the battle shifted into a massive struggle for the ridges surrounding the town: Garrison Hill, Jail Hill, Kuki Pike, and Tiger Hill. The Japanese dug into these ridges like ticks, forming a new outer ring of defenses that the British Indian forces would have to storm at enormous cost. They knew retreating now meant abandoning the entire Yugo offensive. They would not give up easily. The defenders of Kohima were relieved, but the fighting intensified. The ridges became battlegrounds of extraordinary brutality. Attacks were launched up slopes so steep that men had to crawl on hands and knees. Machine gun positions hidden in the jungle mowed down entire platoons. Artillery shells landed close enough to shake the earth beneath soldiers' boots. Rain began to fall, turning the slopes into slick mudslides and the trenches into waterlogged pits. It took weeks of constant combat for the British Indian forces to claw their way up the ridges, dislodging the Japanese bit by bit. The entire landscape changed. What had once been a quiet hill station became a scarred battlefield littered with shattered trees, burned-out huts, craters, and debris. Men fought face-to-face among roots and rocks, killing with grenades, bayonets, rifles, flamethrowers, and charges into the teeth of machine gun nests. As May approached, the Japanese lines began to crack. Starvation ravaged their ranks. Many Japanese soldiers died before reaching the front. Others collapsed during attacks. Disease spread rapidly. The 31st Division, once proud and confident, now resembled a ghost army. On May 15, 1944, after more than a month of fighting, the British Indian forces seized the last key ridge. Kohima was saved. But the battle for Imphal, just south of Kohima, still raged. What happened next would become one of the greatest collapses of the Japanese army in all of World War II. While Kohima bled on its ridges, Imphal became the center of a far larger and even more desperate struggle, a battle defined not by a single hill or trench, but by an entire valley transformed into a furnace of steel, hunger, rain, and relentless assault as 3 Japanese divisions tightened their grip around the town and prepared to crush what they believed was a trapped Allied army. Imphal sat in a broad basin surrounded by steep jungle-covered hills, a natural bowl that now served as both fortress and prison for more than 100,000 British and Indian troops, including the 5th, 17th, and 20th Indian Divisions, armored units, artillery regiments, and thousands of support personnel, all of whom suddenly found themselves cut off from the outside world as Japanese columns severed roads, destroyed bridges, and occupied the high ground dominating every approach. From the surrounding ridges, Japanese artillery observers directed fire into the valley, shelling airfields, supply dumps, and troop concentrations, while infantry probed constantly for weak points, launching infiltration attacks through the jungle at night and frontal assaults by day, seeking to fracture the perimeter and split the defenders into isolated pockets. The Japanese believed time was on their side, that hunger, disease, and exhaustion would do their work, even if bullets did not. But what they could not anticipate was the scale and precision of the Allied air supply operation, an unprecedented logistical gamble that would sustain an entire army from the sky. From dawn to dusk, and often through the night, Dakota transport aircraft roared overhead, descending onto rough airstrips or dropping supplies by parachute into marked zones under fire, delivering food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, artillery shells, and even replacement troops, while wounded men were flown out in reverse flow, an airborne lifeline that defied everything the Japanese believed possible in jungle warfare. Japanese fighters attempted to intercept the transports, but were overwhelmed by Allied air superiority. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was sparse and ineffective, and the sheer volume of flights turned Imphal into a hub of aerial movement unmatched anywhere else in the Asian theater. This air bridge changed the entire nature of the siege. While Japanese soldiers starved on half rations or less, Allied troops inside Imphal ate regularly, received fresh ammunition, rotated units, and maintained their fighting strength, transforming what should have been a slow strangulation into a contest the Japanese could not win. Yet survival inside Imphal was far from easy. Japanese attacks came relentlessly, often at night, as small units slipped through the jungle to attack gun positions, fuel dumps, and command posts, forcing constant alertness and brutal close-quarter combat in the dark. Mortar fire fell without warning, snipers targeted medics and radio operators, patrols vanished into the jungle and never returned. The monsoon arrived early, drenching everything in torrential rain that turned roads into rivers, foxholes into cesspools, and uniforms into rotting rags, while malaria, dysentery, trench foot, and exhaustion spread through both armies. The battlefield became a landscape of mud, flies, decay, and death, where the living fought among the corpses of men and animals left where they fell, impossible to bury in the flooded ground. Japanese commanders, under immense pressure from Mutaguchi to achieve results, ordered repeated assaults against well-prepared defensive positions, driving their men forward across open grounds swept by artillery, machine guns, and tank fire, attacks that achieved little except catastrophic casualties. Japanese soldiers charged through knee-deep mud, carrying rifles with little ammunition, many weakened by starvation before they even reached the Allied lines. Some attacks reached the perimeter only to collapse in hand-to-hand fighting, where British, Indian, and Gurkha troops fought with bayonets, kukris, grenades, and rifle butts, killing attackers at arm's length before counterattacking to restore the line. Entire Japanese battalions were chewed apart in these assaults, yet still they were ordered forward again, sacrificed in waves that bled the 15th Army white. As the weeks passed, the balance shifted decisively. Allied artillery dominated the battlefield, firing thousands of rounds daily, breaking up Japanese attacks before they could fully form. Tanks, once thought useless in jungle terrain, proved decisive inside the Imphal Valley, crushing Japanese positions, blasting bunkers, and supporting infantry advances along the perimeter. Gurkha units launched aggressive patrols into the surrounding hills, cutting Japanese supply routes, ambushing exhausted enemy columns, and capturing prisoners who revealed the desperate state of Japanese forces. Units reduced to a fraction of their strength, men surviving on roots, leaves, and handfuls of rice, officers powerless to stop starvation and disease. By late May 1944, the siege of Imphal began to unravel. Attempts to tighten the encirclement failed as Allied counterattacks regained lost ground and reopened limited road access. The fall of Kohima's surrounding ridges sealed the Japanese fate, allowing relief forces to push south and threaten the rear of the besieging armies. Mutaguchi, still refusing to accept reality, ordered his divisions to continue attacking, but his army was already dying. Thousands of Japanese soldiers collapsed along jungle trails, unable to move, abandoned by their units. Others tried to retreat, but found no food waiting behind them, no medical care, no transport, only more jungle and more death. By early June 1944, the siege of Imphal was effectively broken. Allied forces launched coordinated offensives outward from the valley, driving Japanese units back through the hills they had crossed at such terrible cost. What followed was not an orderly withdrawal, but a catastrophic collapse as Japanese formations disintegrated under pursuit, starvation, and disease, leaving the jungle littered with bodies. Of more than 85,000 Japanese soldiers committed to Operation Yugo, over 50,000 would die, the vast majority not from bullets, but from hunger, exhaustion, and illness, making Imphal and Kohima the single greatest defeat in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army. The encirclement had failed, the gamble had shattered, and the road to India remained firmly in Allied hands.
The monsoon did not merely arrive in Burma in the summer of 1944, it descended like a sentence, sealing the fate of an army already beyond exhaustion, transforming every jungle path into a river of mud and every hillside into a death trap as the remnants of Japan's 15th Army began a retreat that would become one of the most horrific collapses in military history. Torrential rain fell day and night, soaking men who had no dry clothing, no shelter, and no strength left to endure it, while swollen streams swept away bridges, animals, and soldiers alike, cutting off what little organization remained and forcing starving units to scatter into the jungle in search of any route westward. Japanese formations that had marched into India as proud divisions now dissolved into skeletal columns of men staggering forward with rifles slung uselessly over their shoulders, many without ammunition, many without boots, many barely able to walk, driven onward by officers who could no longer feed them and discipline enforced only by desperation. Food had long since run out, supply dumps had never existed, pack animals were eaten months earlier, and the few aircraft Japan possessed could not reach the collapsing front, leaving soldiers to survive on roots, leaves, bamboo shoots, and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned villages already stripped bare by earlier foraging. Disease spread unchecked, malaria, dysentery, cholera, beriberi, turning strong men into shaking, emaciated figures who collapsed along the trails and were left behind, unable to rise, too weak to speak, dying alone beneath a canopy as rain hammered down around them. Allied air power now ruled the skies completely, and fighter bombers prowled jungle clearings and mountain passes, attacking retreating columns, transport animals, and supply parties, turning narrow paths into killing zones where bombs and machine gun fire cut down men who had no strength left to scatter. Artillery followed the retreat relentlessly, shells crashing into ravines and slopes where Japanese units attempted to regroup, shattering any remaining cohesion and driving survivors deeper into the jungle. Entire regiments vanished, not destroyed in a single battle, but consumed slowly by terrain, weather, hunger, and despair, their deaths unrecorded, their bodies unrecovered. Allied troops advancing behind the collapse encountered scenes that shocked even hardened veterans, trails lined with corpses, men sitting upright against trees, dead with their rifles still across their laps. Others found clutching grass or leaves, evidence of their last attempts to eat, many reduced to skeletons wrapped in rotting uniforms. Medical officers reported that captured Japanese soldiers were so malnourished they could barely be treated, their bodies simply shutting down despite food and care. Officers were found dead alongside enlisted men, having chosen to remain rather than abandon their units, while others committed suicide rather than face the shame of failure, the jungle echoing with isolated shots that marked the final moments of broken commands. Attempts by Japanese headquarters to impose order collapsed entirely. Communications were gone, commanders lost contact with subordinate units, maps were useless in flooded terrain where landmarks disappeared underwater. Units retreated in the wrong directions, became trapped in valleys, or wandered into Allied positions by mistake, where they were destroyed or captured without resistance. Mutaguchi continued issuing orders from far behind the front, demanding renewed attacks and regrouping that no longer existed, his commands meaningless to an army that had ceased to function as a fighting force. By the time the retreat reached the Chindwin River, the once formidable Japanese offensive had been reduced to a mass grave stretched across hundreds of miles of jungle. For the Allies, the victory was absolute and transformative. British and Indian forces, once doubted after earlier defeats in Burma, had not only held but annihilated Japan's finest field army in Southeast Asia, proving that Japanese forces could be defeated decisively in jungle warfare. The successful use of air supply revolutionized logistics and doctrine, demonstrating that modern armies could survive and fight even when completely surrounded, a lesson that would shape future operations across the world. Morale surged among Allied troops and commanders alike, while Japanese confidence, so long rooted in the belief of spiritual superiority and offensive invincibility, was shattered beyond repair. By the time the rains began to ease, the campaign was already decided. Japan had lost tens of thousands of irreplaceable veterans, equipment that could not be replaced, and, most critically, the initiative in Burma. The road to India had become a graveyard, and the Japanese army that had dreamed of conquest had been destroyed not in a single decisive battle, but in a prolonged nightmare of hunger, mud, rain, and relentless pursuit. What remained was only the final reckoning.
When the guns finally fell silent in the jungles and hills of northeast India and Burma, what remained was not merely a battlefield, but a turning point from which Japan would never recover. a defeat so complete, so destructive, that it earned its grim comparison to Stalingrad, not for a single encirclement or dramatic surrender, but for the total annihilation of an offensive army and the collapse of an entire strategic vision. Operation Hugo, conceived as a bold strike that would shatter British power in India and ignite rebellion across the subcontinent, had instead consumed the Imperial Japanese Army's finest formations in Southeast Asia, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead, scattered across jungle trails, mountain passes, and flooded valleys, many never found, their names recorded only as missing in official ledgers that could not capture the scale of human ruin. Of the roughly 85,000 Japanese soldiers committed to the campaign, more than 50,000 were killed or died of starvation and disease, a casualty rate so catastrophic that it destroyed entire divisions as fighting forces, while Allied losses, though heavy, were sustainable, replaced and reinforced through air supply and growing industrial power, a brutal demonstration of the widening gap between the two sides. The psychological impact on Japan was devastating. For the first time, an entire Japanese army had been defeated not by sudden shock or overwhelming force alone, but by endurance, logistics, and the simple refusal of the enemy to collapse. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle was shattered, replaced by the grim reality that courage and discipline could not overcome hunger, disease, and air superiority. Japanese commanders, long trained to value offensive spirit above all else, were forced to confront the limits of human endurance, as reports from survivors revealed an army that had disintegrated under conditions no doctrine had prepared them for. The loss of so many experienced soldiers, officers, and non-commissioned leaders could not be replaced, and the units that survived were shadows of their former selves, incapable of mounting large-scale offensives again. For the Allies, Imphal and Kohima marked the moment the war in Asia turned decisively in their favor. Indian, British, Gurkha, and African units emerged from the campaign battle-hardened and confident, having proven that Japanese forces could be beaten in their chosen terrain. The success of air supply operations became a cornerstone of Allied strategy, enabling deep advances into Burma that would otherwise have been impossible, while the defeat of Japan's 15th Army opened the road south for the liberation of Burma and the eventual isolation of Japanese forces throughout Southeast Asia. Morale surged across Allied commands, and the campaign reshaped perceptions of the Indian Army, which emerged as a central pillar of the Allied war effort, its soldiers having borne the brunt of some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. The legacy of the battle extended far beyond maps and casualty figures. In the jungles where Japanese soldiers starved and Allied troops endured months of siege, a brutal truth had been revealed. The age of Japanese expansion was over. Never again would Japan mount an offensive of such scale on the Asian mainland. From this point forward, Japanese forces would fight defensively, retreating step by step under relentless pressure, their empire shrinking with every month. Imphal and Kohima did not merely stop an invasion, they reversed the direction of the war, transforming Japan from an aggressor into a force fighting for survival. Today, the ridges of Kohima and the valleys around Imphal stand quiet, marked by cemeteries and memorials that bear witness to one of the most decisive yet overlooked battles of World War II. Beneath the grass and trees lie the remains of men from dozens of nations, bound together by a campaign that reshaped history far from the headlines of Europe. The battle proved that endurance, logistics, and unity could defeat fanaticism and ambition, and it stands as a reminder that the course of the war in Asia was decided not only on beaches and islands, but in the rain-soaked jungles where an army marched into history and never returned.